So for this Petra Kucha, I decided to do the graphic novel Nat Turner by Kyle Baker. I'm Madison Thompson, and I think this book would be a good one to do for the project we have coming up. So to start with the plot, I thought I'd give a brief overview about this book. It's called Nat Turner. It's kind of about the history of Nat Turner. And it starts in Africa, so it's a book about slavery, obviously, but it does have a little bit of a preface in Africa, where it shows like what life was like before being taken on slavery or into slavery. And then it also gives a little bit of the history of slave ships. Like these are very brief parts of the book, but you do kind of get to see the horrors and realities of slavery and the slave ships in a really interesting and graphic way, and some of the decisions that were made. Later on, we get introduced to our protagonist, which is young Nat Turner. If you don't know, Nat Turner is a historical figure, and he led the slave revolt. And his younger years had some formative things where he was smarter than other average children, and he could actually read. And then as the story progresses, Nat gets older and he starts getting really into religion. And he begins to I don't know, he's very smart and he begins to see some of the horrible things that are happening and he wants to do something about it. For example, he runs away, but he comes back. So he escapes slavery and he comes back. And in his older years, he does lead a slave revolt against some of the quote unquote masters of the people. He gathered a bunch of people together and led a slave revolt. Sent a lot of messages. The book in itself is kind of an overview of the Confessions of Nat Turner, which is an actual book you can read. So obviously, in the end, Nat Turner did get caught, and he was tried, and someone wrote down his side of the story and the confessions of him, and that's what this book is kind of about. So, like I said, it is a historical source. It's very much historically backed, and it uses I don't know, a lot of Nat Turner's exact words on the page, which is kind of interesting because it's historical, and it's a different side of history. It's very graphic and detailed. Um, it also includes a lot of primary sources, what I thought was really cool. It includes like diary entries from slave owners, the people who had the slave ships, and it even included this picture of what a slave ship would have looked like, which I thought was cool. So if you're interested in historical stuff, this is a good book. Um, So confession clips, that's what I was talking about earlier. So it has a lot of excerpts from the confessions of Nat Turner. So as the story goes through, it's him retelling it to you almost. And then Kyle Baker, the author, just put images to it, which I thought was a really cool way to do this comic. So something interesting about that, this comic has no dialogue. Like sounds are kind of done, and then if a person is whistling, it'll show a music note, but it doesn't have any actual dialogue of people talking. They might be saying exclamation points, but most of the story is told through the images alone, and then like confession clips and other like diary entries. Abstraction is another interesting feature of this. So one comic book feature is making the background pop out more by abstracting the image. And you can see that a lot here. Here's some of the slave ship abstractions. Um, yeah, it's pretty terrible. Interesting comic features, religious imagery and icons. So icons are kind of like symbols in comics. And one thing I noticed is that when Nat Turner, like older Nat Turner, who led the revolution or the revolt, mostly like religious backed, he was very religious backed. He kind of had a religious symbol where he had that glowing halo. I also like the humanization of the comic features. Like it wasn't just a slave story. I liked how it had that part at the beginning where it did show the human side of the people who were living in Africa. And I think that's really important to show that kind of side. It also had some characterization, which is a feature of comic books, like the bad guys. These two are kind of like the people who ratted out the revolt, and they're obviously very characterized. Some of the white slave owners were also very characterized. Um, yeah, kind of show that there's just not great people. This was another instance of characterization, which I thought this kind of looked like the classic all American, like Western, like Gunsmoke or something. So some of the white people were characterized like this, like very Anglo. It looks like they have like blonde hair and stuff. So that's another aspect of characterization that I thought was an interesting choice. There's a little bit of a warning here. There's a lot of violence in this book because it was a slave revolt, and some violence was really, really graphic, and others was very stylized and more abstract. And I noticed that the abstract violence was more on the black people, and the more graphic violence was shown with white people. Uh, yeah, it's just interesting. This is a multicultural text for our project. I think that's one of, well, partial requirement, I think. So the author is a person of color, and then it is about people of color. The slave revolt, obviously. Um, yeah, it has a. It is a coming of age story. Uh, so here I chose an instance where young Nat Turner is kind of learning to work with white people and kind of like adapting himself. So here he's caught reading, which isn't allowed. So he pretends to know or to not know how to read. And the next few pages shows him kind of like sticking his tongue out at the person. Um, in conclusion, it was a good book, and I think it could be paired well with Monster, which is a graphic novel we read. Um, yeah, I definitely think that those two have comparisons that can be drawn. And plus, you can get this